The Hollywood Reporter just recently put out an article about how the Communist Chinese have invested $800 million through Harvest Alternative Investment Group and Sun Red Rock Investment Group. They launched a private equity fund, studio movies such as Mission Impossible, Ghost Protocol, and producer deals among the investment targets. This is just one of many investments that Communist China is making in our media groups. We talked about how one of the major outlets who own a lot of the radio stations here are owned in large part by the Communist Chinese. We have a 50,000 watt station in Detroit, I think it's WWJ, or WJR actually is what it is. Anyway, it's a huge behemoth and one of many, many countries, stations around the country that are partially owned by the Communist Chinese. They're increasing their stake in our media companies, and this is just one of many things. I mentioned last week that the Voice of America, years ago it was announced that the night crew of the Voice of America was partially being outsourced to Communist China. And then now we have information also that they're opening networks, or a news network here in the United States. So we're going to have the Communist Chinese propagandizing Americans increasingly, even as they open up our businesses here. They're being recruited by our governors. Hu Jintao met with Barack Obama last year, and they hammered out the U.S.-China Governors Forum. And why is this all happening, even as we're bankrupt increasingly, ladies and gentlemen? And our leaders are using Communist China as their personal ATM or their national ATM. So it's just insane. We have the EB-5 visa program, which we've talked a lot about with Vicki Davis on this program, where the Communist Chinese are investing money. Foreigners are able to invest large amounts of money, $500,000 or $1 million, respectively, depending upon the location. And they can literally buy permanent residency within the United States. This is all going on, by the way, while you folks are being labeled potential domestic terrorists because you care about your freedom or because you might speak out. This is all going on, by the way, while your grannies are being groped at the airport. Okay? And the borders are wide open. We have a beheading in Hollywood now by the Hollywood sign, which smacks of these drug cartels. I don't know if that's where the origin was or not, but it reminds me an awful lot. It looks an awful lot like it could very well be drug cartel activity. We have the Mexican drug civil war that's going on the border that you don't hardly hear anything about. And this is Homeland Security. In the meantime, you have Janet Napolitano increasingly fighting screenings of cargo coming into this country. Less than 1% of the cargo coming into this country is inspected. So you talk about terrorist activity. If anybody wanted to commit an act of terror, there you go. It's insane. It's absolutely nuts. It's crazy. It's out of you talk about mental health screening. These people need to be screened for mental health. But they won't be. Anyway, I want to bring up Professor Bill Kauffman. He was a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Michigan, where he specialized in gas dynamics and propulsion. Since junior high school, when he discovered he could propel cone-top beer cans containing several stones of carbide and several drops of water over his house, he has been interested in explosions. The research of his undergraduate advisor, which employed shock tubes, as of great interest, leading to an early industry position where the task was to determine the cause of malfunctions during ICBM test flights. His PhD research at Michigan, funded by NASA, concerned combustion instabilities or two-phase detonations which were occurring in the Rocketdyne F-1 engine to be employed on the Saturn V rocket. These results were applied to develop fuel-air explosives, FAE, for military purposes. This was, however, related very closely to the heterogeneous dust explosions which occurred in coal mines and grain elevators, where a rigorous program of investigations and legislation basically eliminated this industrial hazard, as the Soviets were well known for their explosion expertise, contacts, were initiated nearly 40 years ago, leading to numerous technical interactions, visits, and even residence in the Russian Federation, where the technical opportunities grew to include the various aspects of flight and flight vehicles. Dr. Kaufman has been involved in many things with regard to these explosions and propulsions with rocket science, but he was forced out, ladies and gentlemen. He was pushed out of the university. When he started to notice delegations from China coming in, he was instructed to tell them, show them certain things, which he refused to do. And when he brought this to his superiors in the university, well, it didn't go over very well. Anyway, Dr. Bill Kauffman is joining us now on Govern America to talk about his experiences and his run for University of Michigan Board of Regents. Dr. Kaufman, thank you so much for being back on Govern America.
Good day. You gave a very complimentary background, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
Well, as you kind of cover the waterfront there, the Chinese issue is growing. It's not being addressed. It becomes of increasing concern. Things are happening nationally, or not happening nationally. Things are happening at the state level, and then, of course, the the problem continues at the university. And being trained during the Cold War concerning national security, I have a good idea as to what it was when we dealt with Soviets, and currently, to some extent, still with the Russians. Mm-hmm. But with the Chinese, it seems like there's a total amnesia in Washington that these could be a threat, that they are a threat,
right.
and that we have to deal with them. I mean, when you look at the campaign now, none of the Republican candidates and the Democratic president is not saying a word about China. The trade deficit with China gets bigger and bigger. Our financial situation continues to deteriorate. The run-of-the-mill espionage by the Chinese continues. I mean, I think the most recent case was Thursday of this week where they caught some Chinese stealing things from DuPont. And the question is, what in the world is going on? It's like we have some crazy people determining our national policy.
I just don't understand it, Dr. Kaufman. Before we get it too deeply into this, can you real briefly, I mean, I touched upon it in your bio, but I would like you to take us back to when you were at the university. You were teaching, propulsion and explosion detonation, this kind of thing. But can you tell us about your time there, what you saw, and what was your first sign? When did you first start noticing these delegations coming over, and how did this whole thing transpire?
Well, in retrospect, I mean, the first delegations came in '79 because of Jimmy Carter wanting to prevent a humanitarian disaster from occurring in China, and we were to train Chinese professors in skills that would help them survive and go on their own. And I had people in explosions, like coal mines and rice mills and sugar mills and things like that, and I taught them, what to do in order to prevent explosions. And when they went back, they worked on weapons systems. They didn't work on safety in coal mines because they still blow up every week. And so that was the first group. But then in the 90s, the University of Michigan signed their first agreement with China, and we started getting a trickle of senior people. And then by the beginning of this century, it became enormous. And they're mostly graduate students or postdocs. They're not here to learn calculus. They're here to learn American technology. And in our department, we had specialists on nose cones, anti-satellite weapons, and we had people go over there and lecture on cruise missiles. And and they got right down to business. And I had in 2005 a Chinese citizen as my department chair. And it was clear his business was to collect technology for China, and his area was aerodynamics, and it's my opinion that he helped develop the J-20, their stealth fighter, by things that he stole while he was over here. Mm-hmm. And he's the guy who tried to make me transfer Trident ballistic missile technology to the Chinese, and that was a straw that broke the camel's back and got me kicked out of the university by Mary Sue Coleman when I refused to do it. And now he in 2010 he defected back to the motherland, where he now is provost at Hong Kong Technical University, and it goes on at other universities too. But they're just looting our national treasure chest concerning industrial technology, which you need for economic survival, and concerning military technology, which you need for military survival. And it goes on at other universities, and the government is clearly aware of what's going on. I mean, I first went out in the open about this with the government in 2006 when there were two representatives here from the Department of Defense wanting to know if some kid from Traverse City should get a security clearance. And I said, it's not the kid from Traverse City you should worry about. It's all these Chinese out in the hallway. And they were literally shocked. Oh, my gosh. We never noticed.
How could you say that?
And then it got kicked up to the FBI, and they've gotten tons of emails, et cetera, from the University of Michigan, like how to...
Oh, let's pick it up right there, Dr. Kaufman. We're up to the first break already, and we're talking with Dr. Bill Kauffman, former professor at the University of Michigan, and we're talking about the communist Chinese invasion in the United States, the takeover that's underway here as our economy continues to tank and we continue to be vulnerable. Dr. Kaufman, you were mentioning before the break how the government is well aware of this problem. As a matter of fact, if memory serves me correctly, didn't you testify recently before Congress sometime, I guess it was last year in 2011?
Well, I haven't made it that far yet, but on the 12th of May, a colleague and I went to Capitol Hill, and we met with, I think it was 14 representatives and congressmen and or their staff.
Okay.
And we basically heard the same thing from every office. I can mention Marcy Kaptur, Frank Wolf, Randy Forbes, etc. And when you went there and you told them what's going on, they said, "Yeah, we're aware of it." And every time we push an issue to promote America and to diminish the significance of China, well, we get pushback. We get calls from the White House. We get calls from cabinet secretaries. We get calls from captains of industry. We get calls from the news media saying, why are you bashing China? Because China's our future. China's our friends. And then the other thing that we heard was that the U.S. government, federal level, is infiltrated with Chinese moles. And they mentioned that this goes back to 1948 when the revolution occurred in China. And, and one person that they openly talk about is Elaine Chao, who was Secretary of Labor and wife of Mitch McConnell. Somehow, I think her grandfather or father fought with Chairman Mao, and they said that there are Chinese sympathizers throughout our government, and they asked, when you go back home, would you please try to find patriots who would support us in our favoritism of America over China? And I think most people are familiar with Wolf and his issues concerning the space program. He's told NASA that they cannot transfer to China technology that China could use in going to the moon. And there's been an open battle between the White House and Wolf over this provision, which was actually passed into law. So it seems like at the federal level, there are people who want the Chinese to take our assets and basically take over our nation. And then at the state level, you find the same things. I mean, here in Michigan, Snyder is clearly sympathetic to the Chinese, going back to his Gateway computer days when he moved production over to China. And then you have his testimony before Congress saying what a great blueberry market China will be for Michigan blueberries. And then we have the bridge issue, where he wants to build this new bridge, which when you start to look at it, it looks like all the money's coming from China to basically put a combination of superports, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Prince Rupert, British Columbia, the Trans-Canada Railroad as a vehicle for delivering the Chinese goods to America via Winnipeg and Windsor. And you look at the thumb area where Huawei is proposing to put in wireless communications, so presumably they can listen to what's going on. And then you get to the local level of the University of Michigan, where they've totally sold out to the Chinese. This spring, we're having the third biennial executive conference of Chinese university administrators here. 40 of these people are going to be over here hanging around for 3 weeks, presumably learning the secrets of higher education in America. Then you have in April a conference organized by the University of Michigan Law School at the in Washington D.C., where for 2 days the subject taught by experts in the law school is how to transfer your American corporation to China or to India, and it just seems like there's a stealth invasion going on. And we have
it seems like it's like the 800-ton elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah,
except
nobody
favorably.
wants to talk about it because there are people who are profiting off of this. I mean, I've often said that the espionage and sabotage that's going on at the University of Michigan far exceeds the aggregate from Benedict Arnold forward through Ames and Pollard's, et cetera. We've done more damage to our country. And you have these people who are profiting off of it, and that's why I decided to run for regent, because we have 8 regents that are supposed to supervise what's going on at the university. Well, 7 of the 8 are attorneys, the 8th married to an attorney, and these people have clients who have business interests in China, and, hey, helping export our stuff over there makes money for them. And then we have one regent, Andrea Fisher-Newman, who's vice president of Delta Airlines. She came up through Northwest, and as I found out while attending the Moscow Air Show, Amoco Beijing is a big MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul facility for aircraft. And they are doing the heavy maintenance work on Delta and United aircraft. The 747s, the 777s go to China for their C&D checks, where they basically disassemble the airplane and put it back together. And you mentioned Homeland Security. How's Homeland Security watching these guys over there? I mean,
Well, it came out just recently. In fact, we covered it on the show, how they were talking about all these electronic gadgets in some of the military equipment, and how this could be detrimental in a battle-type situation, because the Chinese have a tendency to sew faulty parts within, along with good parts into these things. So it's crazy. All right, let's take the bottom of the hour break. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us, folks. And Dr. Bill Kauffman is our guest this hour as we're talking about the Chinese delegations coming over here and the stealth invasion, as Dr. Kauffman calls it. Dr. Kauffman, you were mentioning earlier about the universities. I want to come back to that because, you mentioned that the University of Michigan, even though that's one at the fore of this problem, certainly isn't unique in allowing Chinese delegations to come over here. How widespread is this problem of the universities allowing Chinese to come in here and showing them sensitive information? Would you say that how many? I guess the question is, do you have any idea how many universities that we're talking about? Do all of them do it?
And there's good documentation of some of it. I mean, I think Forbes magazine mentioned that we have 150,000 Chinese graduate students and postdocs currently in the United States. We have a very good write-up from the University of Maryland. We know that Purdue's doing it. And just recently, there was a small state university in South Dakota that came to the fore because the Chinese students weren't even going to classes there. They were basically buying their degree. And the reason it's going on is money. They pay out-of-state tuition. At the University of Michigan, we have 3,000. So that's 3,000 Michigan's kids that aren't getting in, and the Chinese are paying out-of-state tuition. However, there's a lot of subsidies going on, and if you take the information from the U.S. Embassy Beijing at the University of Michigan, the entire state appropriation of approximately $250 million is being spent to subsidize the Chinese students who are here. And then you have government programs, especially in engineering, where there's almost all Chinese students, and they're getting stipends for doing the research. And the real irony of this is, Obama goes to CMU, Carnegie Mellon University, and announces last spring that he's going to land a ban on manufacturing, and we're going to reinvigorate our manufacturing. And he gave 5 grants to universities. One of them is the University of Michigan. And you're talking about tens of millions of dollars for these grants. And guess who's running it at the University of Michigan? A Chinese national professor. And guess who are all these graduate students? Chinese citizens. So Obama is proving manufacturing in China, not in America. And recently, I had a Michigan father say to me, well, he went over to see his son, who's a graduate student, one of the few Americans. He says everybody in the building was Chinese, and yeah, that's the case. And the other thing that you get into is the university likes their China connections because of their investments, their endowments, and we know at least $100 million of University of Michigan funds are invested in China. And then you get into insider trading, where, okay, you go to China and they say, well, we want to send you 500 graduate students this year. Will you take them? Okay. And, oh, by the way, if I were you, I'd watch the stocks of these Chinese companies because we know that they're going to succeed. And, hey, you can make money illegally by dealing with the Chinese and their growth of technology and manufacturing over there. So, they basically have taken over, and the regents, they think it's fine because, hey, we're making money off these folks.
Dr. Kaufman, I'd like to ask you some questions based on some things that I have recently found.
Sure.
On a European website, I found an article titled China Power Giants Go Shopping in Europe. And in this article, it states that a quarter of Portugal's power grid is going to be sold to China, and that also they have recently purchased 7 power grid systems in Brazil, a 25-year lease in the Philippines to run its power network. And I also found a very interesting article out of Lockheed Martin that basically that the general manager of energy and cyber services at Lockheed Martin is apparently very, very concerned that as the United States goes to what they call smart grid, power grid systems, that they have almost all been primarily developed by the Chinese, and he feels that this is a security problem. Now, interestingly enough, on Forbes, January 5th of this year, a writer named Nijam Arora wrote an article titled Obama Acts to Counter Chinese Military Threat. Now, according to this article, he says Obama is opposed to reducing the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet, and there is an initiative to lower the U.S. military budget by apparently $1 trillion. But he's basing this, he's opposing reducing the aircraft carrier fleet because he sees impending threat from China. This article also states that Obama is planning to shift strategic focus to Asia and the Pacific out of the Mideast. And he says that there are plans to send many Marines to Asia and the Pacific. Now, we know for a fact that the U.S. is building a large base in Australia, and the article states that new military alliances with the U.S. are being developed in India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, the Philippines, and Japan. Now, this is interesting because you've got Europe, who has terrible economic problems. They're selling their power grid systems to counter these economic problems to China. And at the same time, we have terrible economic problems. I'm wondering if we are selling U.S. assets to China to deal with this. And at the same time, however, we have President Obama acknowledging that there's a military threat. How do you feel about this?
Well, you've made significant observations. And yes, we are selling assets to China. There is a large conglomerate electric company, I can't think of the name right now, that the Chinese have bought up. There's also the downtown port of Toledo that's been bought by the Chinese. There's also Sagamore Steering, which is now next to your steering in Flint, that have been bought by the Chinese. So they are accumulating assets, and the reason they're doing it is, well, the states' governments need money, and the Chinese have a lot of paper dollars that probably are going to become worth less and less. So they want to convert this into real property. So they are acquiring assets to do this, to dump their paper money. And regarding the military, yeah, it's very significant. I mean, I think you know the old joke that there's no atheist in foxholes. Well, Obama can clearly see that, at least on some level, the China situation is becoming part of the 2012 election. And the Pete Hoekstra commercial on the Super Bowl really showed that, the great sensitivity of Americans to this issue, which is far ahead of their government. So he has to look like he's doing something. And I still have contacts with the military, and they express great concern. Like, we are diminishing vis-a-vis the Chinese. The Chinese are getting modern weapons systems. They're getting them very quickly because they're stealing everything they need. And there's going to be a confrontation in the South China Sea over the Spratly Islands or something. And yeah, the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia are looking for us for leadership. But is it really going to be there in the depth we need? And then you get into, okay, the Chinese are not fighting with obsolete weapons anymore because they've stolen it from America. So now we're going to get into a Cold War arms race with the Chinese when we basically have no money in the national treasury. And this week's Aviation Week had a very interesting article. You know, the F-35, the replacement for the F-16, the Joint Strike Fighter, it's called. It's coming along. It's way expensive, and it's gold-plated, et cetera, et cetera. But apparently 3 years ago, the Chinese hacked into the Lockheed Martin computer systems and got basically everything they need to know to build an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. So now we're saying to ourselves, well, is this new fighter going to be better than what the Chinese have? Well, maybe we better make a few more tweaks and whatever to it so we have something better than the Chinese. And somebody really has to stand up and say, enough is enough. We're tired of talk. And
one thing that is interesting to me, too, is I teach at 2 universities, and I have had the opportunity to speak to several military men.
Yeah.
And I have asked them all, what are you told is the greatest threat to the United States? And I was actually expecting people to say Iran. And they all said, no, China. And, you know, what the military, therefore, if they're telling military personnel that China is the greatest threat, what is the plan of the American military?
Well, you know, the military serves at the whims of the president, okay, just like the FBI. And you may have people who exactly perceive what's going on, but if you speak out, you're going to give an early retirement, or you're going to be assigned to Fairbanks, Alaska. And at some level, okay, there's people keeping the lid on of what people really know and are concerned about. And it's interesting that you mentioned Iran, because I came to the University of Michigan as a 25-year-old graduate student in 1965, and in my classes were Iranian students. Shah was in power, and instead of having Chinese students in the classroom, we have maybe 30% of the class are Iranians.
Yeah, oh, I remember that time.
Okay, and here I am. You know, we're learning. We're here having a lecture on how to enrich isotopes of uranium, or we're having a lecture on how to make shaped charges such that they compress the extremely high densities solid material like uranium. So people are running around right now saying, "Oh, the Iranians are a threat because we have the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Russians all giving them stuff." No, it actually started in 1965 when the University of Michigan was giving them stuff. And
then we have Leon Panetta coming out and saying that basically Iran isn't anywhere close to having a nuclear weapon. So, I mean, the question is what to believe, number one, and number two, you know, is all this stuff just being, the rhetoric being built up so they can start another war, which ultimately very well could lead, I think, to a war with China.
Well,
you know, this is, go ahead.
Academe is the biggest proliferator of weapons of mass destruction in the world. Okay, when you're worried about biological warfare, chemical warfare, nuclear warfare getting around, it's because of the roles that the universities have played. And when we invaded Iraq in 2003, the students said to me, "Would you give a weapons course?" because we might get into the Marine Corps or the Army and go over there. So for 2 years, yeah, I gave a weapons course. Then this new Chinese citizen guy arrives as department chair. He says, I don't want American kids learning about this stuff. You know, it's dangerous for us, okay? And then you find out that, yeah, Chinese weapons did appear in Iraq. They're appearing in Afghanistan. So, and then when I had a fight with the university over this issue, they suggested to me, well, why don't you go to China and give your courses? We'll double your salary. We'll give you a maid. We'll have a driver for you. You'll live in a comfortable house, and we'll take care of you. You know, like, you don't understand what the Chinese are doing. I perfectly understood what the Chinese were doing. And I refused to do that, and I guess that was getting pretty near the edge, and they decided, well, we don't want this nut around the university anymore. So
wow.
We're just giving things away. People are making a deal with the devil. Everybody thinks they're Neville Chamberlain. Okay, they're lining their pockets. And I don't know what they think about their children and their grandchildren, the people who are expediting, our arrangements with China. But people have to stand up and say no. And if you take our elected officials, like Carl Levin, John Dingell, Debbie Stabenow, they all know about the Chinese problem. They all know that federal funds are supporting Chinese graduate students at the university. And Tim Wahlberg asked me about 6 months ago if I would write up a summary of what happened at the University of Michigan. We had met with him before he was elected and told him about the Chinese threat, but he's done nothing. I wrote up 7 pages. It's called a 30-year history of espionage, sabotage, and treason at the University of Michigan. But he's done nothing with it. You know, I would like to figure out how Chinese campaign contributions get in, and we know they did with Bill Clinton and Charlie Tree. Clinton took a lot of money from the Chinese that we know about, and then, you know, Christopher Cox in 1998 wrote the Cox Report, 800 pages long, of the theft of American technology up to that point. And
that's still online today. Anybody that wants to read the Cox Report, just put it into a search engine, and it'll come right up.
Yeah, and you'll be appalled. And they stole every one of our major nuclear warheads, including the W-88, which is a hydrogen bomb, which is on the Trident launched ballistic missile. And we need someone of the courage of Christopher Cox to come forward right now and say, hey, I'm going to do the last 10 years and see what these people have stolen. And I think people are fearful of that because they're going to say, oh, they got almost everything. And what are we going to do about it? You know, 10 years from now, when the Chinese decide to confront an aircraft carrier in the Taiwan Straits, you know, what are we going to do?
They've already threatened to nuke Los Angeles, if memory serves me correctly, over Taiwan. If the United States interferes with a Taiwanese invasion by the Chinese, that they'll just respond with nuclear weapons.
I think it's a question of when this conflict's going to occur. And we did not update the Taiwanese F-16s like we had promised them to. And the Chinese, they've come up with this new short-range ballistic missile that's supposedly effective against carrier battle groups. And they just keep upping the ante. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is, 1.3 billion? That's so many people that, what's a couple thousand or tens of thousands of Marines that the Chinese would lose in an invasion. And when you look at the spying thing, I mentioned the one from DuPont. Well, you can find one from Dow Chemical. You can find one from Ford Motor Company. And it's kind of the catch of the day for the FBI, like which Chinese spy are we going to catch today? And the Newark and Los Angeles office put out a monthly bulletin kind of cataloging all this stuff that they've been able to do. And pretty soon we're going to have more Chinese spies than we have jail cells to put them in. And someone just has to take the bull by the horns, like this Randy Forbes and Frank Wolf, and say, no more. And you need somebody in the White House who's going to say, no more.
Yeah, amen. And this is why we're doing this program, ladies and gentlemen. This is why we keep hammering this issue. Because it's going to take a groundswell of public opposition and vocal people coming out against this thing and exposing it for what it is. We're being badgered by people that call us racist for addressing this issue. And nothing could be further from the truth. All right, we'll take a break. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. Nancy Levant is here, and we're visiting with Dr. Bill Kaufman today. He's a former University of Michigan professor, and he is running for the U of M Board of Regents because of this China issue. He can't get anything else done any other way, so he wants to run and try to steer it, and of course, steer the university back on to the road to sanity, hopefully. All right, I want to go to Ron in Arkansas. Ron, what's on your mind?
Dr. Kaufman, Darren. Most Americans do not understand the Asian culture in the first place.
Okay, Ron, I'm going to have to ask you to turn your radio down.
I'm sorry. Had some good music on there. When I was stationed in China in 93, 95 in Guangzhou, we had 65,000 Chinese students in the United States. None of those students came back to China. Now, I've argued with college presidents and all these guys that have cities that have sister cities in China, and they think this is so glorious. And the Chinese know how to wine, dine, and entertain. But they have the best on-the-ground spy system in the world. And the families are all linked, and all you have to do is take up the phone and say, Grandma's sick, she needs an operation, we need this. And that's taken care of. But Americans don't seem to understand that. And Guangzhou was a pretty interesting tour, seeing how all that worked when I was there. And it just keeps growing. You look at the medical schools here, and most of our, higher education for masters and stuff with all the Chinese here. But it's a real problem, and people just don't understand it.
Well, Dr. Kaufman, let me just add in there, too, if you could address the caller's question with this in mind, too. You know, the U.S. has a very long history of selling military weapons to foreign countries. Why, in your opinion, is this sharing of current information with China different?
All right, let's pick that up on the other side of the break. Stay with us, Ron, Nancy, and Bill. We'll be back here in a moment, folks. This is Govern America. Don't go away. This is Govern America. As we continue on here, Nancy, you had a question just before the break.
Well, and it does fit in with the caller's question as well. What I said was we have had this very long history of selling military weapons to foreign countries. There's no doubt about that. And so the question is, why is the sharing of weapon systems, of information or weapons with China so very different from the other occasions?
I will agree that weapons technology has great commercial value. And yes, we've sold weapons to many people. However, probably in the last 2 decades, there's now a lot of competition in the world. Everybody's selling weapons technology to everybody. And we can note one of the previous callers, even the Israelis are guilty of selling weapons technology to China and allowing it to leak away. But I think the basis of all this is the word communism. We're talking about communist China. Historically, we have many Chinese in America, Chinese Americans. And they came over before 1948 when the communists really took over and threw the nationalists out. And having been to both countries and lived in the Soviet Union and in Russia, I would say that the current Chinese communist regime under Hu Jintao is probably more severe and radical than that under Lenin and Stalin in the 30s. And it's interesting. Go to U.S. State Department website, and you can get the very, very large report on Chinese human rights there. And there's also a similar report. There's a joint U.S. House, U.S. Senate committee on China, and they deal with human rights too. And in both places, you can read the gory details of the liquidation of 75 million Chinese by their own communist government. And, in the news this week, we have monks in Tibet or Western Sichuan province who are setting themselves on fire to protest what is going on in China. And you can read details of the killings in Inner Mongolia, Tibet, of the Uyghurs in the New Territories region. And you look at what China is doing to Tibet, it's typical Chinese suppression, first thing they did was build a railway there. And now they're moving into Han Chinese. They're forbidding the teaching of Tibetan in the schools, et cetera, et cetera. So we're dealing with a very repressive regime, just like we have in Syria, we had in Libya, et cetera. And we don't want to transfer weapons and technology to these people because literally, Khrushchev said it, but he never did it. The Chinese do have the capability of burying us, and they're not going to treat us very nicely. And you
know what's sad about this too is clearly there is a societal and educational momentum and movement toward Marxism.
Well, yeah, but it's kind of failed in Russia. I mean, Russia after the summer of '91 really did revert to its traditional Christian capitalist roots. I mean, we can say we have a few crooks in the Russian government. We have a few crooks in the U.S. government too. So Russia really did give up on communism as being failed, but in China, it is a communist dictatorship. And then earlier on, we talked about these businesses like coming over here, taking over phone companies, steel mills, or whatever. And isn't it marvelous that it's capitalism? But no, it's state capitalism. The people who come over are from Sinomec and other similar type things, where it's a state company you're dealing with. It's not a bunch of private people, who've gotten a brilliant idea and are going to implement it. It's the state government that we're dealing with. And
the scary part about this too is that universities are government institutions, and when we have policies set into place where universities are forced to share secrets with a communist country, that has to have something to do with government policy.
Well, I would not say here that the University of Michigan is forced. They're doing it because of the greedy administrators we currently have at the universities. When I first got into academia, we had true scholars. They wrote books, they taught classes, even if you were dean. But now we have full-time businessmen and businesswomen running the university. And Eisenhower warned of the industrial military complex is doing in the country. No, what's doing in the country is the academic commercial complex of we can make money doing anything. And in Michigan, with the state universities, you have the problem with the Constitution of 1961, which almost makes universities into sovereign states, that state legislatures will not meddle in the universities and just give us the money. It's $350 million a year, which is about 10% of the budget currently here at the University of Michigan, and don't supervise us because the Board of Regents will supervise us. Well, that's a total fraud because the Board of Regents have been co-opted into this deal. Like you can make money for your clients off of China too, while selling out America. So universities have no supervision, and in Michigan, that is there's an attempt made to address that deficit. There's a state rep from Saugatuck, Bob Ganetsky. He has House Bill 5000, and he says, "Yeah, go ahead,
Dr. Kauffman. Did we not give the Russians a lot of our nuclear secrets during the Lend-Lease program in the 40s?
No, we did not. We
you
gave.
Sure?
Yes.
I'm not.
I live in the middle of the arsenal of democracy, and I've lived over there in the Soviet Union and Russia, and we gave them the traditional armaments. Okay. Now, you can argue that the Rosenbergs and that group at Los Alamos transmitted the implosion design of the bomb, which was the uranium, the plutonium bomb, to the Russians, and maybe there's some validity to that. But recent books have basically exonerated Ethel Rosenberg. And when you look at the Soviet weapons designer like Zeldovich, Sakharov, they were really very clever guys, And the Soviet hydrogen bomb, which was first set off in 1953, which is about the same time we set it off, was truly an innovative Soviet design. So while
you may like the Russians, but I don't like them, and I don't trust them either.
I mean, earlier on, it was mentioned about racism, and this is what some of the criticism was about the Hoekstra ad. But when all logical arguments fail, you finally get down, well, this is the last one I can throw out to you. But the Chinese people are oppressed by a communist system. And as far as Russians go, we have a lot in common with the Russians. We read their literature, we listen to their music, we watch their ballet, and they have a great admiration for America because as I wandered around the villages, the first time I went to the Soviet Union was 1981, and you would go to a village and people would come up and thank you for the Lend-Lease stuff, a Studebaker truck, a Dodge truck, machine guns that were made in Saginaw. They would thank you for helping them defeat the Nazis. And I think both our nation and the Russians should study how the Cold War happened, and in my estimation, got totally out of control. You can probably say, well, it was Joe Stalin's oppression of Eastern Europe which did it, which is interesting to look at because that's eventually what bankrupted the Soviet Union. They couldn't maintain all these troops in foreign countries and have any money. And
I agree with that.
And that's what's happened to us. We have military bases here, there, and everywhere over the world, and we're getting into this fight and that fight and whatever. And weapons are very expensive these days.
Yeah, well, I was a career Marine, so I flew some of that, and I had carried nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
But I resigned my commission just because of some of this stuff.
And you wonder sometimes, what are the politicians thinking when they get into some of these messes?
Well, when I met in Washington with a Senator Tower from Texas, I came back from Vietnam, and I told him my story.
Yeah.
And he told me he'd been told the same by higher authority. And then I asked him, who runs this country? He never answered me. And that's when it dawned on me, and this is 1968.
Yeah.
And it dawned on me, Congress doesn't run this country. If you go to Congress, you're not going to do anything. They're going to trap you. If senators don't run this country, I have no idea who does. Because anybody with a common sense would not allow these programs to get through. It's like John Kennedy says, you get in charge of the President of the United States, and if you have a GS-10, write a memo that changed the world.
Sure. Now, one of the people I admire was John Glenn. He was an engineer, pilot,
right,
hero, astronaut, and he later became a politician. And I think his early training obviously affected the decisions that he made as a politician. And there are a few people like that. And right now, when I'm deciding, okay, I'm going to be regent, you have to do this, that, and the other thing, well, you find out that the system is pretty disgusting corrupt.
Oh, it's horrible. I was with the State Department. I know. Don't ask me how I got in there. I was on the right-wing zealot there, but I was there.
and one of the things I ran into in the last 2 weeks was, are you willing to pay $50,000 to $100,000 to the party to be their nominee?
That's right.
No, not. And then the answer is, well, you'll never get to be the nominee.
Yeah.
All right, hold it right there. Ron, thank you for your call. We got to take a break here. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. All right, we're back. This is Govern America. I'm Darren Weeks. We're visiting with Dr. Bill Kaufman today. He's a former University of Michigan professor and a rocket scientist. People say that it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you this or that or the other, and here we have one today talking about exactly what the threat is here. Dr. Kaufman, I want to, before we go back to the phones, I want to bring out this initiative, this situation that we have going on in the Middle East right now. We have this war that's being engineered, in my opinion. I think that what we have developing here with Iran and Syria, there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of concern that what we have with the Iranians issue is, especially once this develops, once this thing breaks out, and who knows when that's going to happen. My concern is that, and others share this concern as well, that we're going to have a situation where China is going to be on the side of the Iranians, as will Russia, and we're going to end up with a World War III scenario. You know, when and if that happens, and I think it's probably a matter of when, not if. We have all these Chinese businesses here. What happens with the Chinese businesses in a case where we go to war with China? You know, years ago, there was a document published called the Project for a New American Century. It was a report by the neocon think tank. It's called the PNAC report. And they planned out the countries they wanted to go into and have a regime change in ahead of time, before 2001. And they even mentioned in that report how they needed a new Pearl Harbor type event to trigger it off. And they got that the following year. And they pulled off 9/11. I mean, if anybody that looks into this would, I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion. There's more than enough evidence. But the point of the matter is, they laid out various countries they wanted to go in and have a regime change, and it seems to me that they have followed that plan to a T. And one of the countries was China. They wanted to have a regime change in. Now, so we're seeing things unfold worldwide that are following this plan. And so what happens when we go to war, if we go to war with China, with all the Chinese here, all the businesses here? You know, I asked another guest that we had on, Bob Chapman, the same question, and he said, well, they would be closed down. But when we have them increasingly in control of our economy,
and
how would we be
grid.
able to put all these people out of work? You see the problem I'm getting at?
Well, the problem you're getting at for me is I'm an engineer because I like to deal with things, because they're kind of predictable. When you're dealing with people, you're dealing with things that are unpredictable. And they have different values, and their mind works in a different way than someone coming up through engineering. But yeah, I mean, so I was very happy being an engineer, and now I've gotten somewhat involved in politics, and I think all the things you say are relevant. I mean, we have Chinese who have been here since they were brought over by Leland Stanford to build the railroad, and to me, there's no doubt about their loyalty. There's also a lot of Chinese in Canada that, for example, when Hong Kong reverted back to the mainland, Canada sold visas and citizenships, etc., to settle in British Columbia. And, and what is their loyalty? If you go to Africa, like East Africa, and look at the animals like we did years ago, what you see is almost all the businesses are run by Chinese. And then you get into something we alluded to earlier, weapons proliferation. I mean, there's weapons everywhere, and of varying technologies, or shall we say, damage capabilities. I mean, AK-47s are all over the world because of a Russian arms deal who was recently apprehended by the United States. And there's U.S. weapons, all over the world. When you look at the police in these Middle Eastern uprisings, most of the police gear, I mean, they pick up a tear gas can off the street, and where did it come from? America. Okay. Now, if you look, if you say, well, here's Iran, yeah, we can pretty much figure out that Chinese stuff is coming there. Maybe it's laundered through North Korea. You can't ignore what they're doing. And the Russians, yeah, I mean, they sold the original nuclear stuff to the Iranians, the reactor, Bushar, or whatever. And now the Russians, voted against the Syrian resolution in the UN. But at least I think we have some open channels of communications now with the Russians. And you bring up a very interesting point here. When I taught my rocket course, it was 3 credits for 1. And I used to tell the students that with what they knew, and if they could get a good auto-body shot, they could probably build the equivalent of a Scud missile, which is short range, but, long enough to do damage.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty easy to start manufacturing significant weapons. But then what happened when the Soviet Union broke up was, the demand for military technologies dropped off. You had a lot of unemployed people who were Soviet weapons scientists, and they migrated out into the world to sell their skills. And one of the reasons that I was over there living in the early 90s was to fund research to keep these people busy and find out what technology they had that we might use. Well, we couldn't employ everybody, so some people from the Soviet weapons establishment, went abroad to North Korea and showed them, well, here's what we know about making missiles. And then the North Koreans picked it up. I mean, that's how the Japanese got started, by copying things and selling them on the world market. And then, well, they eventually make their ways to Iran and other places that are hostile to us. And then you look at the Pakistani situation, them getting the bomb, and they stole technology everywhere through their professor who was roaming around. So yeah, a lot of people have things that they shouldn't have now, or we wish that they didn't have, and and how do we undo this?
Dr. Kaufman, let me ask you, knowing you have military contacts, what is your greatest concern? Is it a nuclear conflict? Is it a political or economic takeover of the U.S. by China? What is your worst-case scenario?
Well, it's hard. I mean, you've hit a couple nails on the head. Slowly, we're losing our economic and military capabilities because of China. Okay, it comes down to that, and no one recognized it, and no one seems to be reacting to it in spite of things that are said. Okay, with the Soviets, we were on the very edge for many years. I don't know. Maybe during the Cuban Missile Crisis and during a launch situation of a rocket from Norway, maybe we were closer than we had ever been. But it seems now, at least, we have civilized conversations with the Russians. But you have these people in Iran and probably some other places, Syria, where you don't know how probably they're going to respond. They have little to lose other than they're get killed, okay? And what do they care if they wreck the whole country? So it's hard to tell, which thing is going to flare up in the next week or month. But I think I would say confidently that unless we do something about the Chinese situation, the trade balance, the loss of our technology and weapon systems to China, that within 10 years, you better learn Chinese because there's not going to be much here that we can control anymore. And this gets into a thought I've had of an engineer. You always say, what are the consequences of what you're going to do? Like Apollo 13. Okay, suppose on the way to the moon something goes wrong, and can we patch it together to get people back? Well, we did, and there's other examples like that too. But you look at some of these political things. We don't have a Department of the Future. People talk about eliminating government departments like education and the other things. But there ought to be someone in Washington who says, what if? Okay, what if the Iranians get the bomb? Okay, what are we going to do? How can we prevent them from getting it? And it seems like there's very little anticipation or vision of future events. Okay, and we're always playing, well, how are we going to react to this? Not how are we going to prevent it or whatever. So we have to get in there and interfere with some of these things that could go wrong, but we don't know what's going wrong. And people will say, as Yogi Berra said, it's hard to predict the future. Yeah, I'll agree with that. But it's not totally impossible to anticipate some of the things that might happen.
Dr. Kaufman, I'm wondering strategically, what can we do? What would you recommend? I'm sure you must have given this some thought. aside from your run, of course, for the U of M Board of Regents, what can folks do, on a state level, on a local level, to try to steer the political situation, at least to get some recognition for this issue? You mentioned earlier in the program about here in Michigan how we have a governor here that's basically sold us out. He's very compromised in the situation with China. The bridge, and I believe he told one of the Tea Party members, if memory serves me correctly, that China can build that bridge. And you talked about the funding for the Ambassador Bridge that they want to build. But from a state level, which I really think is probably the only way we can really get this back, what would you recommend folks do? Maybe writing letters to the editor in the newspaper to get this issue out in the forefront, and educating lawmakers?
Well, I would reject dealing with the media. Very small portion of the media knows what's going on. You're one of them. But you can go to Channel 7, Channel 2, Channel 4, and say, hey, there's a real scandal at the U of M. And they basically go, yawn. Okay. They're more interested in the body in the dumpster that night. And there was some scandal involved with the General Motors bailout. And Joe Johns from CNN was going to do a story on it. General Motors calls up Ted Turner and says, we're going to jerk all our advertising from CNN if you do this story. Joe Johns was told to forget about doing this story. So there are very few good, sincere investigative reporters around anymore. Okay, there's a new network, I think it's called HDNet or something. They're independently funded by some guy who left them a huge pile of money. Maybe they'll do something. I participated in the March on Snyder's house of a few weeks ago. Okay, and I was told, well, it's just going to be liberal hippies from the progressives and whatever. No, there were people there from every political belief that you can believe in. And when I was talking to a person who headed up a national organization in Washington earlier this week, and he said their approach to politicians is that the only thing they care about is their reelection. They can get elected on green things, and they can get elected on labor issues, but when they get to Washington, the only thing they do is what's going to affect their reelection. And that means fundraising. Okay? And, of course, they can be bought and sold like cattle at auction. Okay? And I think people are going to have to participate in primaries and say, hey, you're not doing a good job, and I'm going to primary you. But the thing you run into is that the two parties pretty much control the system, and they have their own interest. That is, raising money so they can survive, have nice parties and receptions, etc. And there's a very real fundamental question. Maybe it's being addressed by the Occupy movement. Most people think that they're extreme left liberals, but that may be the case with some of them. But I think conservatives, and I've tried this with my local Tea Party friends, and I've had little success so far, but I think conservatives and liberals might find a few things that they agree on which really affect the future of our country. And that's the most important thing now.
The main thing that I've found with the Occupy movement is that, they're largely, undirected in terms of, it's like a mob without really any real goals. You know what I mean? And that's the main thing is I haven't really seen any goals that are really bring them to some sort of real solution. But anyway, I want to go back to the phone lines. We have callers piling up here. Let's go to Warner in New Brunswick. Warner, thanks for holding on.
Hi there.
Yes, go ahead.
Media spin and try to find solutions. And I fully have to agree, there's too much short-term thinking without any kind of long-range planning. And I think that's where the Chinese, especially the Chinese, are way ahead of the West.
You're absolutely true on that, and almost all the Chinese leaders are engineers by training.
Mm-hmm. And as I say, they haven't forgotten their traditions. And the Chinese empire and the Chinese people that have been around for at least 3,500 years and have been a force in the world. You know, they don't become that by being just short-term thinker.
You're right, and I would say 5,000 years. And one of the things you learn living in Russia or Poland is that out of the east came Mongol hordes many times during those 5,000 years. And yeah, and not only are the engineers, I mean, they can suppress dissidents, and you know, I mean, you have a totalitarian government. And one of the interesting things in Istanbul, as you may know, there's a museum of the Silk Road, and in there they have many things from China, et cetera, you know, that Marco Polo brought, et cetera, but including porcelain. And one of the things on the card there was that the Chinese would execute any porcelain worker who divulged the secrets of the making of porcelain. So here the Chinese, you know, 2,000 years ago were protecting their technology. Now, you know, we're not protecting our technology.
Until the German chemist or alchemist found it out on his own, developed porcelain, like Meißner porcelain.
Sure.
Yeah, but as I say, since you mentioned about the divulging of secrets, and people should remember, you know, what happened to the Rosenbergs.
Yes, that's right. And in my estimation, being trained by various security people during the Cold War, I would say that the Rosenbergs probably contributed very little to the demise of our nation compared to what's going on now. I mean, when you look at, maybe the Rosenbergs made one little sketch on a piece of tablet paper that was reduced to a microdot. Now, at the University of Michigan, when the Chinese students go home, they have a suitcase full of thumb drives of all the things that they've used during their research.
And here it comes in quite a bit funding. I don't know to what percentage of the university. It comes out of taxpayers' money.
That's right. At the University of Michigan right now, in the physical sciences, we have about $1.2 billion in federal funds. And it would be very easy for John Dingell or Carl Levin or Debbie Stabenow to say, we are not going to fund the work by Chinese students. And in 1965, when I came here to get my PhD, I worked on a NASA project that was noted, and it was U.S. citizens only. And we ought to have that.
And as I say, you know, every journey starts with the first step. And shouldn't the first step should it not be done and basically lay treason charges against the administrators at the universities?
You're absolutely right, and there are what shall we say, everyday law enforcement agents who would agree with that. But when it goes up the chain, they run into resistance at higher levels. We know that Mr. Mueller of the FBI was reappointed for 2 years by the current president. And
as I say, you know, that's in one way it can be an obstacle. On the other side, it can be an opportunity to identify all the rats in the system.
Well, that's right. And you know, as Ronald Reagan said, if they don't see the light, we make them feel the heat. And there are allegations now in Michigan concerning very close relationships between one of our Washington, D.C. politicians and the General Electric company. General Electric recently put in a small manufacturing facility, and then they bought Smith's Instruments. Smith's Instruments is clearly under the guise of civilian instrumentation for airliners, is exporting technology to China that can be used on military aircraft. And the same with their engines. General Electric is exporting engines from Ohio to China that clearly has military implications. And it would appear like they bought protection from one of our significant politicians so that nobody
Dr.
does
Kaufman,
anything.
is it true that the University of Michigan is building campuses in China?
Oh, yes, we have a huge campus in Shanghai. We're granting
and who paid for that?
Well, that's not clear, okay? And one of the state politicians who protected the University of Michigan under charges about China. She lost the primary election, and now she's the dean of our campuses in China. And that was her prize for 6 years of protecting the U of M.
Do we have any clue whether the taxpayers of the state of Michigan paid for that facility?
I would say it's very possible, and we are right now buoying the contracts that created that, and the university's fighting it tooth and nail. And we have had a very good piece of luck concerning this in that the Thomas More Law School in Ann Arbor has come forth and said, we will help you get the information that you need. And then talking about politicians, the governor, Rick Snyder, is accused of exporting recently military technology to China. MEMS, microelectrical mechanical systems. And they're used in precision-guided munitions. And it looks like he has exported technology to China that will help them make smart weapons. We filed a complaint with the Department of Commerce, and it looks like they're sandbagging. They don't want to expose the governor of Michigan of violating weapons control technology.
All right, let's hold it right there. We got the final segment straight ahead, and we'll try to get to as many calls as possible when we come back. Let's go to Rodney in Illinois. Rodney, you're on with Dr. Bill Kauffman.
Dr. Kauffman, are you aware of a Chinese defense minister named Chi Huishen, who in February of 2006 gave an address to high-level military personnel? This speech, as the story goes, was discovered and translated, and it outlines in a very candid fashion China's agenda for dealing with their own overpopulation and what parts of the world that they have set their eyes on and how they're going to accomplish their own colonial agenda. And it is very telling in that the United States is a target where mass depopulation of our country is intended, and that they would come in and occupy this real estate. I can't confirm the authenticity of this, but I could tell you where it can be found. There's a former host, an RBN host named Dr. A. True Ott. His website is atrueott, OTT.com, and under his Dr. Ott's papers, it's his #1 posting under his papers titled China. And I can't really get into any specifics because of time, but I was just curious, had you heard of this foreign minister? Was there such a foreign defense minister in China? And encourage you to pursue looking into this.
I appreciate that, and I cannot recall him specifically, but we can see their activities in Africa, we can see their activities in South America, and yeah, I mean it's no longer the ugly American; it's the ugly Chinese. And indeed, I'm interested in conservation, and I saw an article recently in one of those magazines that the elephant in Africa will be extinct within 10 years because Chinese workers are poaching the elephants to send the tusks back to China. Then the one country you didn't mention is Canada. And there's a large Chinese effort, and we've gotten 2 interesting Canadian reports on this, where the Chinese have given up on Mexico to come into the United States because of the drug violence. And what they're doing, they are now going to come in through Canada, through Prince Rupert, British Columbia, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Halifax is related to the widening of the Panama Canal by the Chinese, and the Trans-Canada Railroad, and then they're going to ship stuff south at Winnipeg and Windsor. And that's where the Governor's Bridge comes in. And, it's always we watch the southern border, but we better pay attention to what the Canadians are doing on the northern border. So, yeah, I mean, we've obviously caught their interest, and they're coming. Or they started coming, a year ago, 2 years ago, a decade ago. And they plan long term, as we heard earlier.
Right. Exactly. Well, thank you, Rodney. I appreciate the call. Heather in Oregon, real quickly, if you can, please.
Stones. That's how they're colonizing this country, leveling the world playing field, and then they can depopulate and get their $500 billion that they want to service them.
There you go. Agenda 21.
And another way they're doing it is through the Confucius Institutes. I mean, they're starting them all in many cities in Michigan. They're also sending their junior and senior high school students over here to go to school, and yeah, they're just sneaking in, and no one has noticed yet.
All right, we are out of time. Thank you so much, all the callers, and thank you, Dr. Bill Kaufman, for being with us. We'll keep hammering this issue. And folks, go to his websites. They're linked up with ours. God bless you, folks. Pray for this republic. Do what you can to restore it. We'll talk to you next week.